The rebellion knew no district nor creed it couldn't tempt with fragile promises. District 1 was home to the Great Houses, an elite group of wealthy families who had married capital citizens for their fortunes and pure blood. These families governed over the district's territory, irrigating the vineyards, mining diamonds and producing luxurious silks. But in the decades preceding the war, members of these great houses became estranged from their capital kinsmen over inheritance disputes and lack of influence in Panem politics. These grievances in time would fester into bitter envy. The bonds of marriage and family were not easily broken, but one's assumption of loyalty is another schemer's ladder to chaos. When District 13 declared war, it was assumed that District 1 would obediently run to the capital's side. Rather than seeing the gift of their pure blood as an acceptance into their master's rank, the Scions turned on them and took up arms for the rebellion. They bombed railway lines in and out of the rocky mountain tunnels into the capital and coordinated assassinations of key capital officials. Perhaps greed drove them, or conceivably an insatiable lust for status. In either scenario, the betrayal would not be forgotten. By the war's end, countless of their kinsmen had been slaughtered in the muddy dugout pits encircling the district's capital of Boise. Those still alive to witness the sacking could only remember an engulfing flame that blanketed the city in black smoke. What remained were nothing more than ghouls of a glorious era, charred bones with necklaces of melted gold and gemstones that burned with a single touch. The District 1 houses surrendered, and what little they had left was of no value to the capital save for their blood. What remained of the district was in attendance on the reaping day, but only 4 children were truly considered. Mayor B's daughters were 3. The 4th was the sole surviving son of the recently extinct House Prodigal. "I shall take 1 child from each family," the president said from a televised monitor. "The cost of cutting a vein can only be paid with the blood of a daughter and son. I, therefore, take Eleanora B's and Ali Prodigal as tributes for these transgressions." The Loyalists of District 2 proved their dutiful nature and defended the capital with fire, steel, and soot. When District 13 called its rebels to rise against the regime, late President Ravenstill called forth his loyal districts to defend their country, only to receive a lone response from District 2 and conflicting communications from District 9. The lack of support was a blow to the regime's morale. Still, Mayor Valerius instructed renowned District General Marcus Basso to militarize too and create a rallying point in District 9 for loyalists to the regime. Together, the pair cut off the rebel supply lines to the east and starved out the rebel districts to the west. Their work involved conscripting all eligible youth between 12 and 18 to work the district's armories and steel mills, some even fighting on the front lines. In time, those who rose through 2's ranks would join with capital soldiers and be awarded the title of peacekeepers, members of a militarized force created after the war, dedicated to maintaining peace and security in the districts. When it was finished, District 2 remained untouched. The rebels dared not take the district's citadel of Ayen, so while the rest of the country burned, it fell upon the district to take up the reconstruction labor. The president offered titles, lands, and wealth to the loyalists who took up arms for him. Mayor Valerius accepted, but General Basso rejected the proposal. "The rebels will not forgive us for turning against them," he said in a private meeting with the president. "Punishment for all but favorability for one will ensure another costly rebellion. I propose we amend the treaty's articles and allow our district to offer tributes as a sign of our fidelity." And so the president agreed. Come to reaping day, a female and male tribute would be chosen. General Basso would offer up his bastard daughter Tooth, a girl with a fiery temper whose time training under her father earned her the name Mad Dog. As for Mayor Valerius, his firstborn son Cain would represent the district. The boy was quiet but had served his time on the battlefield. Some spoke of him in high regard, but he was noted as savage when provoked by the sound of gunfire. The Jabberjay project was the first successful implementation of genetically engineered creatures for acts of espionage. Drones and spies were the capital's only means to gather information on its enemies for decades, as surveillance over the districts had proven effective in the years before the war. However, sentiment against the capital began souring. Human spies became more malleable, chaotic, and unreliable. District 13's rebellion was a well-funded and organized machine that would require ingenuity to control. And so the Jabberjay was born. Jabberjays were the first mutations of their kind, having been genetically engineered from male blue jays. They were capable of mimicking human speech and emitting complex sounds, all the while trained to obey commands with ultrasonic signals. At the start of the war, they were released into the northeastern territories of Panem, most notably Districts 3, 8, and 11, before seeing operations in Districts 4, 5, and 7. The project gathered information on rebel battle plans and operations for a year undisturbed. The birds would perch on buildings and trees during the day and fly for miles during the night to capital outposts. However, soon their unique migratory patterns piqued the suspicion of rebels, and thus the project's initial success began to see a steady decline. It wasn't long before a group of jabberjays fell into the hands of District 3 rebel scientist Marquis Banks. They were triggered and studied, and their recording capabilities were discovered before being rushed to the attention of the district's mayor Bizet. From there on, secret rebel communications devised a new plan, and the capital's jabberjay operation quickly unraveled due to whispered lies and vast misinformation spread. The fallout would lead to the project being abandoned and the birds euthanized. Come winter, it was assumed that all remaining had perished. All, save for 2. On reaping day, Techna Banks stood in the same position her father, the Birdman, had before he was hung for tampering with capital technology. Next to her was Kay Bizet, his mayor's father's punishment for organizing the elaborate scheme. The last surviving jabberjays chirped their names on repeat, carrying their tunes from District 3 to across all of Panem. Neutrality was a declaration of war. All those who failed to come to the aid of the capital were considered enemies of the state. District 4 was one of the wealthiest districts, with a robust economy emphasizing fishing, technology, oil production, and agriculture. The district was more self-sufficient than any other district in Panem or the capital. Its power lay in its naval strength and fishing lanes. While the capital ruled the remnants of the ruined North American landscape, District 4 ruled the seas, promising its ships in return for greater economic freedom. Naively, the capital allowed them to continue as they had been. When war finally came, District 4 was one of the only districts that chose not to fight on either side. Instead, it opted to supply the rebels with food and ammunition while providing the capital with wealth to prolong the war effort. Mayor Halibut calculated that the longer the war was, the more likely the capital would fall, allowing District 4 to secede from Panem altogether and become its own nation. Leading District 4's naval operation was Admiral Sid, a stern commander who, in the 4th year of the war, broke with the mayor's neutrality and assisted the rebels in assaulting the capital-controlled District 5 by sea. The assault would lead to the rebels capturing the district and causing power blackouts in Capital City, an act from which District 4 could never recover. Admiral Sid was executed when the capital prevailed over the rebels, and his son would be reaped for the first Hunger Games. Meanwhile, Mayor Halbert's 2 eldest sons had gone off to die on opposing sides of the war, and his remaining daughter had just turned 3. He was without eligible children for the reaping until his wife revealed to a capital informant a bastard daughter the mayor had been protecting for several years by that point. He called his daughter's name Kit Scholes, dropping the slip of paper on the stage as a beautiful young woman strutted up the steps. The snivelling 12-year-old Leifa Sid followed up right behind her, and the pair stood together while the district watched on in a mixture of anger and defeat. A tidal wave of depression consumed Mayor Halibut, and he sank below the tides when he threw himself off a cliff later that night. The majority of life lost in the capital was attributed to famine, disease, and aerial bombardment. District 13's bombers worked closely with rebel technicians in District 5, disrupting the capital's air raid systems and cutting power to the city. In the 2nd year of the war, the capital looked up at a crisp blue sky as iron shells fell upon the city. Those inside their homes tried to take shelter as their living rooms exploded before their eyes, while those outside screamed and bled as their clothes turned to embers. Fires raged from twilight to dusk, and clouds of concrete blanketed the city for days. District 5's Commander Wong declared that all those residing in the capital were complicit with the president's crimes and would be judged accordingly. On behalf of Mayor Noor, he led the effort to target capital civilian infrastructure and disrupt the flow of communication entering the city. For 3 years before the fall of District 5, The capital bled and starved as its citizens burrowed underground into their basements and tunnels as their great city turned to ash and dust. Mockingly, the air raid alarms would ring only after the bombardments had been completed. Most of Panem, save for the capital and District 2, had lost power by the war's end. The lights and cameras flickered in and out as the names of the district's tributes were called. Rika Wong stared blankly at the cameras as citizens pelted her with trash and screamed obscenities for her father's costly actions. Standing beside her, the boy, Gamero Nor, reached out and clutched her hand in his own. They smiled somberly, and the pair lifted their fists into the air in solidarity. The broadcast was abruptly shut off as rioters encroached on the Justice Hall and dragged the mayor into their mass. Smuggled goods and firearms set the rebellion onto a conveyor belt of destruction. Some years before the war, Mayor Giuseppe Bologna of District 6 had begun a correspondence with District 13's military advisors to express dissatisfaction with capital mediation in district trade affairs. At their guidance, he contacted members of the Myers Railroad Company for a solution to the dispute. The family-owned railroad titan was known to deal primarily in iron and coal importation from Districts 2 and 12, but at the mayor's request, they laid the foundation for a network of arms dealers and smugglers. The family first intercepted capital military convoys in some of the poorer districts like 8 and 11, before quietly moving those arms on their privately owned railways during various train stops on their scheduling. Over the years, a number of the capital's firearms had gone missing and were presumed stolen. The late President Ravenstill had become so distracted by the turmoil in the divided capital Senate that swept the missing weapons issue under the rug until it was far too late. The weapons would reappear on July 4th when District 13 declared war, sparking massacres and riots throughout the districts. The onset of anarchy took the capital military completely by surprise, and any attempt to quell the fighting with soldiers and riot armor was met with disastrous results. The citizens of the districts took control of their towns and cities and began killing capital soldiers to make their points. From then on, despite their best effort to contain the fighting, it was undeniable. Panem was at war with itself. 5 years later, the same day the war broke out, the mayor's daughter took her place next to her father in front of the Justice Hall. She nodded and he whispered into her ear. The cameras zoomed in on her face, colorless. The girl's plain expression turned from static to furious instantly. She coldly stepped to the side, shrugging her father's embrace before he gave up and called the boy Tribute's name from the reaping bowl. The Myers family's last surviving son, Bannon Myers, took to the Justice Hall, shoving past peacekeepers as they escorted him to the stage. He ignored the jeers and whispers of the district's foul denizens. Whatever these games entailed, he could not harm anyone on the outside, so he would look at those within. And in that moment, he stared up with contempt-filled eyes at Sarah Bologna, making up his mind. Your fault. Two adverse factions arose at the outbreak of the war, rebel extremists and those unfortunate enough to be caught in the crossfire. District 7 was divided into different native settlements and townships inhabited by an indigenous and colonist population. Its citizens were never unified in the same way as those of the more industrialized city districts, so each settlement declared allegiance individually based on self-interest. At the behest of the district's mayor, Mayor Lyndon Jackson, any settlement that failed to take up arms against the capital would be considered enemies of the rebellion. Public executions of indigenous folk refusing to fight or attempting to flee the war became commonplace as a means to scare the population into complying with the mayor's demands. By the second year of the war, the entire district had become a breeding ground for rebel activity and prejudice. Chieftain Otis Morning was a highly respected leader in his tribe who chose to fight rather than unleash the wrath of the mayor and his sycophants. However, he grew to hate the rebellion and its leaders, seeing the subjugation of his people as becoming no different and even worse than the capital. Nonetheless, he continued to fight on the side of the rebels, though from time to time also shared his district's plans to the jabberjays perched in the trees above him. For his jabberjay stunt, Morning expected capital leniency for his only daughter and tribe members once the war had concluded. He was, however, mortified to find that while he himself was pardoned of all treasonous activity thanks to his efforts, his tribe was rounded up and hung, and his only daughter called up to the reaping stage, all for his initial role. The girl looked at her father in shock, quietly crying as a soldier grabbed her. The mayor smirked as he looked down at the turncloak in the crowd below. He convinced himself that it was poetic justice until he plucked out a slip of paper from the boy's reaping bowl and recognized the name of his own son. Richard Jackson appeared in the aisle limping, badly bruised, and bleeding after having been missing for days. The boy had been kidnapped by rebels in the indigenous settlements prior and beaten severely as revenge for what they had to endure under his father's leadership. When they were done, they surrendered him to a local infirmary, where he was gathered in time to be escorted to the square and now up to the stage. The broadcast shut off as a gunshot rang in the air. Lies, secrets, and murmurs said in the dark could spill loom into threads of chaos. As massacres turned into battles and battles turned to war, District 8 was left in the precarious position of leading the rebellion's effort to the east. Mayor Holt's regime had seen an unlikely bridge crossing the southern seas, an alliance formed with the Neutral District 4. For the price of whispers, the fishmongers would provide the district with weapons and protection by the sea. Ships would arrive in the dead of night, at abandoned ports hidden behind mist, and leaving quickly as they arrived. Nets and old hooks were stitched into snares, and used harpoons would begin to appear, hidden away in crates. In the third year of the war, the ships stopped coming. Factories were raided, shops, looms, and collaborators were frequently shot and burned. Those who lived escaped to what was perhaps a gruesome fate. Capital soldiers were released in waves that worked their way into the district from the north's abandoned coastlines. Outer towns were left ravaged. By the time they reached the district's capital of Atlanta, Mayor Holt surrendered before they tore down the walls. The reaping was a somber affair. Starved masses heaped into the square, at the mercy of peacekeepers they helped clothe. Their craven mayor stood before them fresh and clean, reeking of rich cologne, bright colors against a pale district. Nobody fought when a young woman was plucked from the crowd. Skinny, slickly, and struggling, they brought her up to the stage. Sophia Holt, neglected daughter of the coward. The name Klaus Loomer was soon called after, the son of the mayor's mistress. The brothel madame turned District 8 spymaster was a socialite in the districts and the capital before the war. Having owned numerous pleasure houses in the districts, both rebels and capital soldiers visited them to ease their suffering. Under canopies of satin, and by the flicker of burning candles, the soldiers spoke their worries. They spoke of the war, what they'd seen, and what they'd hoped would never happen. The workers listened intently, caressing their faces and providing an all-too-comforting shoulder to cry on. Madame Loomer was the true power in District 8, not the mayor. She used this information her workers gathered to guide the rebellion's battle plans and prepare ambushes months in advance. But the spider's web could only be spun so far and would ultimately unravel as the houses of pleasure turned to pillars of ruin. If loyalty hadn't saved the favorites from 2, then there was surely no hope for the farmers of 9. District 9, composed mostly of disgruntled farmers, chose to align itself with the capital. Another instance of a divided district, the ongoing feud between field hands and urbanized city workers only heightened at the start of the war. To embolden its supporters, the capital only had to disseminate disorder. At the order of late President Ravenstill, steady streams of propaganda and fabricated reports were filtered into 9 for media consumption, to play off of the farmers' irrational fears that their urban counterparts and the distant district rebels were attempting to brainwash their children and fundamentally abolish their way of life. Though their harvests were scarcely as bountiful as what the rebels of 11 had access to, the loyalist troops of 9 survived many a night on hardtack and bread made of flour from their district's wheat production. As the rebellion fought for and demanded change, the capital continued to promise 9 the same familiarity and foundation that they'd been used to for years. As it turned out, the grain farmers who had been wielding scythes and pitchforks all of their lives were also rather capable when supplied with firearms and allowed to become radicalized. It was Mayor Green who was in charge of organizing militia groups, guerrilla fighters who would hide out in the sprawling landscapes and harass rebel troops as they attempted to advance, tiring out the opposition until they could wipe them out completely. District 9 was famously hard to overtake. The workers turned soldiers defending not just their rulers, but their homes and their families until the bitter end. It was not uncommon for one loyalist fighter to sacrifice themselves so that the rest of their ragtag group could secure a key victory. Sacrifice would become the theme of the reaping. Unlike District 2, District 9 had wished to be exempt from the games entirely, but those in the capital's War Department were ultimately swayed by the words of those from the Masonry District. The decision was made amongst the general population of Loyalist troops and begrudgingly agreed upon by those who commanded them of who the female tribute should be. It should be one of the commander's daughters, they said. The common foot soldier had sacrificed himself many times so that the commanders could continue to lead the war effort. Now it was time to repay that blood debt. The commanding officers ultimately decided to send one Celery McCleary into the games, a difficult but necessary decision to ensure peace. It was with a heavy heart that Mayor Green sacrificed her son Philip to the games. It was her duty as a true-blooded citizen of Panem to remain loyal to the capital. However, she held nothing but resentment in her heart for the citizens of District 2 until the day she died. Defeat meant extermination, but upon surrender the slaughter prevailed. No district was as motivated to revolt against the capital as the ranchers of District 10. Covering large swaths of untamed land, the district, by population alone, had an army that outnumbered the capital's forces. What it lacked in technology and equipment, its people made up for in manpower and geographical tactics. The rebels primarily focused their attacks on capital-heavy military settlements, armed with shotguns and Molotovs. They galloped on horseback, burning down halls of justice, executing capital loyalists, and kidnapping vacationing officials for ransom or persecution. The sheer frequency and brutality of nightly attacks and ravaging fires forced the capital to pull out of District 10 entirely and retreat. Not wanting to completely give up their position, however, they instead opted to move their forces west to hopefully regain control of nearby District 5. This precarious situation did not bode well with District 10's mayor, Mayor Braun, and so with the support of General Miller, they initiated a covert operation known as Operation Lissa. Through the deployment of spies from regional rebel cells, they would sneakily infiltrate the encampments of the capital military under the cover of night. Upon doing so, they would unleash cages of rabies-infected bats, rodents and dogs on sleeping soldiers to infect entire camps and towns. This use of biological warfare proved extremely effective, driving the remaining capital forces back to their strongholds in Districts 2 and 9 to recuperate. It wasn't until the fall of District 13 that the capital looked back to its earliest defeat. Tanks, horses and foot soldiers trudged through muddy trenches and bowdlerized over rabies-plagued towns across District 10 as they made their way to the district's capital of Nantio. By then, Mayor Braun had sealed the gates of the city, entrapping its citizens as capital forces closed in on all sides. Depraved and unrelenting, he commanded his generals and soldiers to begin executing every citizen in the city. The capital may take the district and the city, but they would not take their lives if he had a say. Appalled by his command, a mutiny broke out within the mayor's mansion. According to multiple witnesses, Mayor Braun and his family were beaten and taken hostage by his soldiers in the wine cellar beneath the mansion. His final orders were not communicated down the chain of command, and come noon, General Miller had brokered District 10's official surrender to the capital. In exchange, the capital spared the city from destruction, but took one of the mayor's daughters and General Miller's son hostage as a precautionary measure. As for what was to be done with the mayor and his remaining family, the president made his intentions clear: send in the dogs and seal the doors. Hunger was a weapon. During the war, District 11 was one of the rebellion's key strongholds, controlling Panem's food supply. Most of Panem's fresh fruits and vegetables were produced in the district, surpassing the output of other agricultural districts such as 4, 9 and 10. With its strategic positioning in the south-central of Panem, it was possible on either side to starve out the rebels to the east or the capital loyalists to the west. The survival of Panem would primarily lay in the hands of which faction could take the district first. The battle over District 11 would last the entirety of the war, resulting in both sides ultimately starving. Some rations from District 11 would make their way to the heart of the capital through means of stealing and smuggling, but the rebels would catch on and devise a countermeasure to prevent further thievery. Dr. Nadia Levisky was one of District 11's homegrown minds and a leading figure in the rebellion. With the consent of Mayor Amelia Riker, the two planned a covert operation to lace capital-designated rations with a specially crafted rat poison. The poison was a crushed-up substance that upon consumption would cause a person to endure an excruciating heart attack as they bled from every orifice in their body. Should any spies infiltrate their food stock, they would take the unguarded rations, unknowing of what was inside. Many capital children were the unfortunate victims of this operation. The beauty of ruby-red apples and amethyst-shining grapes was unmatched by the power of starvation. It was said that the capital screamed from dusk until dawn, the night their children died. And as their children took their last breaths, so too would the children of the rebellion. On reaping day, Dr. Levisky would be sickened as she watched her young daughter Ginevra be dragged from the crowd and presented to the district as their first of many sacrifices to the games. Maybe now she could understand what it would feel like to watch someone you cared about suffer, knowing that their fate was already sealed. The choice for that year's male was equally as simple. Mayor Riker, the logical thinker and the meticulous planner, was left a sobbing mess as her son was taken away from her. The mayor herself took charge of planning and organizing the transportation of their precious food to the front lines. Her district supported her, just as they had during the war. They supported her right up until she was publicly hung for her crimes and replaced with a more agreeable capital puppet. That, of course, would only come after she'd been forced to watch her pride and joy bleed in the arena, as she had done to countless other children. The rebellion could only succeed so long as fire was burning. District 12 wasn't a district of fighters. Its people were known to live a simple life in the forest outskirts of Panem, mining for coal deep in the ground below. Most had never held a rifle before, nor were they prepared for combat. All they knew was coal mining, and their coal would be instrumental in fueling the power plants and machinery of the capital or the rebels. For in time, if hunger couldn't kill the other side, then surely the cold winter would. Mayor Harlow Donner was no coward, but he wasn't a fool. He'd seen firsthand what corruption was like under the capital, and he'd heard stories of tyranny in districts that refused to surrender to District 13. No matter what side of the coin won, all would remain the same. Nothing would ever change. Nevertheless, District 12 pledged support for the rebels. Mayor Donner and Commander Rook Baker submitted to any wartime demands, preferring rebel participation over capital execution. But nothing could prepare its citizens for the horrors they would witness when the capital finally made ground from the west. The Battle of the Red Lake would be one of the last and most instrumental clashes near the end of the war. Capital forces and District 12 rebels would meet near the outskirts of the district at a nearby lake and fight ceaselessly for weeks. The battle was one of the war's bloodiest skirmishes, claiming countless lives on both sides. Rifle fire could be heard for miles as the boom of cannons shook the trees, sending mockingbirds to flight. The battle would finally end when, on the last winter, snow fell on the rebel army with not a fire left to burn. District 12 surrendered, and in just a few weeks, District 13 was annihilated by capital bombers and wiped off the face of Panem. The Dark Days Rebellion at long last was defeated. For their role in the war, Mayor Donner and Commander Baker were sentenced to death, but not before they could see justice brought upon them. Jacoba Donner would be reaped for the first games, and with her the commander's son, Orion Baker. The pair would be dragged kicking and screaming as they witnessed their district be massacred before their very eyes. Merchants, apothecaries, traveling musicians, and anyone else the capital deemed as traitors were executed for aiding the rebels. No one was safe so long as people believed they had the power to defy the capital. From then on, all of Panem lay witness to a new era, an era of peace and security, one where all of Panem could exist united with a single purpose, an era where its people could look up and find hope in the valor of their fallen, and remember the tragedy of the war, where a lone victor could emerge from the rubble and raise their fist in triumph to end all wars. The era of the Hunger Games.